Okay. Hi, Eve. How are you?
Good, Douglas. How are you?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
So, I'm looking at your bio, and it's 3 pages long, and it's all about the book. And it goes into a lot of detail about your book, but it says nothing about the author. So, before we start with the book,
Really?
can you give us a little bit of your backstory?
Sure. I worked in publishing for many years in New York City. I worked at Random House. I did various things. I scouted, which is reading manuscripts for foreign publishers as well as Hollywood. When I became a mother of triplets, I left Manhattan to raise my kids. I moved out to the east end of Long Island where I had summered as a kid. And now that my children are older, I work as a bookseller in our local bookstore, BookHampton.
Okay. Did you know you were going to have triplets?
I did, well, after I was pregnant, I realized that, or I was told that my numbers were off the chart and I should expect three babies.
Well, that's amazing. Did you have an ultrasound?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. But first, they take your blood test and something, I think it's HCG or some kind of marker notes. Um, if your levels of whatever are very high, that prove that you're pregnant. And mine were.
Well, I've never interviewed anybody who's had triplets before, so that's kind of interesting.
Okay.
Are they identical?
No, no, no. Two boys, one girl.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, how old are they now?
Oh, they're 24 now. I'm over
Oh, okay.
it.
They've moved on and moved out
Right,
probably. Yeah.
right.
Okay. So this book that you've written is called Track 61, and why don't you just give us kind of an overview of it? We don't want to give it all away on the show
Mm,
because we want people to buy the book. And if we go into too much
right.
detail, people are going to feel like they've already read it. So just give us just kind of an overview of the book.
I was searching for a story. This is my second book, and my first one was based on New York City history and a well that is still exists 200 years later after a young woman was murdered in it. So I was searching for another story that really resonated with me. And one of the places I began looking was Grand Central Terminal because I think the terminal is just a really beautiful landmark in Manhattan. And there's so many hidden secrets there. So, one of the things I discovered when I was looking was something called Track 61, which is an abandoned rail spur that lies under Grand Central Station. And as I began to research Track 61 because it interested me, I dug up a personal connection to um, Track 61 and the story. The personal connection being that in the summer of 1942, long before I was born, Nazi saboteurs landed from a U boat off the shore of Amagansett, New York. And as I read that, I kind of got a chill down my spine because when I realized where these men had landed, it was virtually in front of the house where I grew up.
Wow.
So, yeah, so their supposed target, or one of their targets, was Grand Central. So, those two things, my personal connection and the mission Operation Pistorius that these men were on, allowed me to craft historical fiction about this event.
Okay, so you took those two events and then created a fiction around it, like what if kind of a scenario?
Less so. I mean, a little bit. What if? The what if being the men absolutely landed. The men had their targets. The men spent a week in Manhattan evading capture. The what if really comes from the fact that the house where I grew up in with my family, including my maternal grandmother, who was a German Jew who had fled Hitler. And the irony that she had watched my sister and I build sandcastles on the same strip of sand where Nazi saboteurs had landed struck me as really significant and the basis of a good story. So the invented part is I fictionalized a meeting for a character based on my grandmother, who would have been a young woman in 1942, to meet one of the saboteurs and become entangled, really, in his plight.
Entangled how? Romantically entangled?
Less so. I mean, a lot of people had said this is a suspenseful romance adventure. Yes, she's a young woman, and she is taken with the fact that she is involved with this man. But I think it's a little bit more of a one-sided romance. But there is an element of a bond between this young woman, Greta, based on my grandmother, and one of the saboteurs.
Okay.
It's not a bodice ripper, but there are strong feelings.
Okay, so the track 61 you said was a spur. So a spur is where they take the trains off to clean them or repair them or something like that, right?
It's the end of the line in Grand Central for this it was a private rail line that was used by dignitaries, most notably FDR was said to have used track 61 when he came to New York City.
Oh, so it's a separate line that only certain people can use.
Right,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
Why would they have that? So that they don't get stuck in the traffic of all the other.
I think in FDR's case and in other cases, it was a matter of security. A lot of people think that for FDR, it was to hide his disability from the public. He would arrive on track 61 and take a private elevator up to the Waldorf Astoria. The elevator was said to be large enough to accommodate his limo. So he would be, shielded from the public. People would not necessarily be aware of his disability.
I know that the Secret Service wouldn't allow anyone to photograph him being lifted out of the car, lifted into his wheelchair. They would destroy film if anybody had it.
There's so much that when one starts to look at historical fiction or even history, you see how events are shaped. And that's one thing, one of the things that struck me when writing this. There's so much that, we think we have all the facts, but propaganda, it exists everywhere.
Where did you find your research material for this?
I was able to uncover, Google is a wonder, on the internet is a wonder. There was ultimately a military tribunal that has a 3,000-page transcript. So I began by reading that transcript, which recounts the events of the saboteurs that landed and their personal statements. Another thing that I read was a memoir by one of the men. So I had that. There were lots of contemporary newspaper reports and several nonfiction accounts.
Okay, and they were planning on what, blowing up Grand Central Station?
It would not have taken dynamite to target what they were looking at. Something under Grand Central, another kind of really secret sub-basement, which is kind of fascinating, the deepest sub-basement even now in New York City, which is supposed to be 10 or 13 stories underground, is something called M42. And it was a power station. So their mission was said to have been to stop the power running out of M42. And it would have taken not necessarily dynamite. They could have destroyed the rotary converters just by dumping sand on them.
Now, where did this power station, what did it supply? The city or?
It supplied the powered trains running up and down the East Coast. So troop supply, equipment supply, and it also supplied an aluminum plant that built airplanes. So if the power to that plant had been stopped for as little as 8 hours, supposedly the electrolyte baths would have hardened and been destroyed, and it would have taken, they say, up to a year to replace them. So that factory that built airplanes would have been destroyed.
Is it too much of a spoiler to ask what happened to the saboteurs?
I think, it's difficult to describe the story without ultimately saying, first, I always want to say that these men were Nazi saboteurs, and I don't want to think anyone to believe that I portray them in a sympathetic light at all. But I found there was a lot more to the story than meets the eye. And I think the story is a very complex one. So ultimately, the men were captured. The circumstances of that have been glossed over and misrepresented over the years. And to this day, the justice they received has really been debated. It's the largest mass execution of people in U.S. history.
Mass execution. Oh, they were tried and convicted and executed?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Did you find it challenging to have a story that was sort of partly true and then have to make up other parts to fill in, or was it a good challenge, or was it a tough challenge?
I don't really feel like it. I mean, of course, I made up dialogue, but there was so much dialogue that was when the men in the trial transcript recounted what happened when they met, for instance, at Grant's tomb for a meeting. You hear what they said to one another. So I really tried to take each of the individual days and set them as scenes. And scenes, the invented part is not so much where they went or what they did. It was just seen through the eyes of this character, a female character based on my grandmother. So I would say that I wasn't inventing so a terrible amount of things. Basically, there was a week they spent on the lam, and I just looked at that as calendar days and created scenes around those days.
Okay, so you knew your grandmother fairly well, right?
Yes, very well. She lived to 101.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you could sort of write through her eyes probably fairly easily.
Yeah, terrifically. I found that I was able to incorporate lots of stories that I had heard since childhood that really made the book, I think, not just more meaningful to me, but because they're true stories, they resonated with me. And I think that they're true stories, so they strike a chord because, truth is stranger than fiction. You can't invent these things. And I think that lots of stories, for instance, a story about my grandmother adored dogs, about her childhood dog that was a German Shepherd that I have a photo of the dog sitting there in a party hat, certainly a member of the family. One day before she left Germany, the dog was to be taken away by the Gestapo to be used for training purposes. And rather than allow the dog to be taken away, my great-grandfather took him outside to the backyard and shot the dog. I had heard that story as a child, and of course, there's so many terrible atrocities that happened during the Second World War. But as a child, that story really struck me because I could relate to it. I had a dog. I loved that dog. I couldn't imagine anything like that happening. So I think that I was really pleased to be able to incorporate stories such as that.
Well, Eve, we are out of time. We're going to have to wind this down. Thanks so much for coming on. The book is out now, right?
It is out, yes. You can look at my website, www.evekarlin, Karlin with a K, books, one word.com, and you can find any information about where to shop for the book.
Okay, great. How long has the book been out?
It has been out since June 13th, which was the 80th anniversary of the saboteur landing in Amagansett, New York.
Oh, so just a week or so, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How's it doing?
It's been a lot of fun. I've been able to chat with a lot of people about the book. I am a bookseller in East Hampton, so we had lots of fun events about the book.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks again for coming on the show and sharing your story, and best of luck.
Thank you so much, Douglas.